You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer.
Yes, I found a flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
My dad was actually taking the trash out one day. He had just gotten open heart surgery. He was just starting to move around, walked over to our trash bin, starts rolling it in, and realizes the sticker on our trash can that says Stupidian, like IAN, and it had like the red, blue, orange, the Armenian flag colors like plastered on there. And someone had pasted it on our trash can, kind of implying that Armenians are stupid. They use the same IAN, YAN, that's very indicative of, an Armenian name.
Hi everyone, this is John Hanson from the Systemic Justice Project and the Flaw magazine at Harvard Law School. In this episode of Flaw School, hosts Giovanna de Oliveira and T. Luong talk to third-year law student Talish Babayan about something that didn't make headlines, but should have. In 2023, Citibank was fined for quietly closing Armenian Americans' accounts and denying them credit, often without explanation. The pattern was hard to miss. The names were Armenian. The closures came out of nowhere. It happened in Glendale, California, where nearly half the population is Armenian. Talish helps make sense of what happened. She traces the history of Armenian discrimination in the U.S. from restrictive housing covenants to name changes made out of fear. She shows how corporate power shapes the rules of who gets to belong, who gets to borrow, and who gets left out. This is about Citibank, but it's also about what happens when corporations write the rules and hide behind legal protections the rest of us can't use. Welcome to Flaw School, the podcast about the flaws in the law.
Hey, welcome to Flaw School, a podcast that explores the flaws in our legal system. We're today's hosts. I'm Giovanna de Oliveira. I'm a 2L at the law school.
And I'm T. Leung, a first year at Yale. We are so excited to be hosting this episode.
Every 2 weeks, we interview law students to uncover the role of corporate actors in producing many of our most urgent social problems, and the troubling tale of corporate actors shaping, bending, capturing, and breaking the law in their favor. In this episode, we'll be discussing Citibank's illegal discrimination against Armenian Americans.
Today, we're joined by Talish Babayan. Welcome to Flaw School, Talish. Class is in session.
Hi, Giovanna. Hi, T. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, Talish. Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to talk to us about this incredibly interesting and important topic. Before we really get into it, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about who you are and if there are any aspects about your personal experience and background that brought you to this topic.
Sure, of course. Thanks so much for having me again. My name is Talish Babayan, as you mentioned. I am a 3L at HLS. I was born and raised in Glendale, California. I'm ethnically Armenian. My parents came to the US in the 70s. My dad was a refugee. He and his family had left Iran and then got stuck in Lebanon during the Civil War. And then on my mom's side of the family, they immigrated to the US from Lebanon, and my great-grandparents on that side were survivors of the Armenian genocide, and they ended up in Lebanon after they escaped. I attended Armenian school until high school. I grew up speaking Armenian in the home, so my Armenian identity is something that's really important to me.
Your article is super interesting to read, and I learned so much, not only about Citibank's discrimination against Armenians, but also about the history of Armenian discrimination and oppression. What inspired you to write this article?
I knew I wanted to write about something that was personal, something that had affected those around me. I figured I'd probably have the best expertise and the best insights into an issue that's dear to me. And I was debating between writing about corporate power during the Armenian genocide era. That was something I toyed with for a bit. But I ended up landing on this piece because it was something that had just happened, and I felt like people weren't really talking about it all that much, and I was wondering why.
In your article, you mentioned several Armenian Americans who had negative experiences with Citibank. Alec Anayan, Alina Armayan, Mary Zambatian, to name a few. Could you share their stories and what happened to them?
Of course. So just to note, I wanted to protect their identities, so I made up some of those names, with the exception of Mary, whose story is public and you can read a bit about her. But what was going on was that several Armenians all over, mainly Glendale, which is this city in the greater Los Angeles area with a really huge Armenian population, I think almost close to 40%. They were receiving letters from Citibank, and they were being told that their accounts and cards were with Citibank were being closed. There were no reasons that were being provided as to why. And so there were a bunch of different stories, a bunch of different ways people were affected. So some people were being denied Bloomingdale's gift cards because of their connection to Bloomingdale's connection to Citibank. Other people were being denied SBA, small business loans. And there was one story actually of a woman who was a previous Citibank employee back when Citibank was CalFed. She dedicated her life to this corporation, and overnight her accounts were closed for no reason. She had no idea why. And these people would go to the bank, they'd ask, "What's going on here? Why is my account being closed?" There was a lot of confusion. Some people were speculating. They were like, "It's probably because you're Armenian." And there's the stereotype that Armenians commit fraud. So there was speculation at the time. No one really knew what was going on, but that was kind of what was happening. People's accounts, cards were being entirely shut off overnight with no explanation. And it was really, really difficult to navigate, especially for those whose reputations were on the line, whose bank accounts were integral to their livelihoods, to their businesses, their day-to-day operations. So it was impacting a lot of people, but people weren't really coming out to talk about it because they were kind of embarrassed. Maybe I did do something wrong.
So that's very helpful in the big picture of what's going on. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit what Citibank was actually doing.
So it seemed like a Citibank branch that was responsible for issuing credit cards and loans was purposely denying credit loans and applications to those who had Armenian last names, much like my own. Armenian last names typically end in IAN or YAN. That really just means like hailing from or son of. So it was really easy to actually locate these people because the names were kind of giving it away. They would hone in on the IAN, YAN last names, particularly of those who lived or operated a business in the city of Glendale, which I mentioned is nearly 40% Armenian, home to one of the largest Armenian communities outside of Armenia. So by searching through IAN, YAN, they were kind of conducting this risk assessment, assuming that there were a couple of fraud rings that were uncovered with Wells Fargo a few years back, I believe. And these banks were getting nervous, and they're like, these Armenians, they're a risk. So let's close their accounts. Let's deny them these lines of credit. They're, quote, bad guys. They might be engaged in fraud. Let's just deny all of their accounts, all of their applications. Who knows who was doing it specifically? One of the attorneys I spoke with was like, someone in New York was probably making these decisions from some high rise, and it was having this effect at this level. And I think she said what was most disturbing was that the Citibank that was operating in Glendale actually realized that it was a great place to start a branch. So a lot of Armenians were actually immigrating to Glendale. They knew that they liked starting businesses. They knew they were really family-oriented people. And they knew that Armenians liked doing business with Armenians. So they opened up this beautiful branch. They hired up a lot of Armenian employees. They used the community to build up their bank, and then all of a sudden turned their backs on that community that they were initially kind of targeting and trying to get to build up. Because Armenians are like, hey, you should come to this bank. My aunt goes here, I go here, you'll get my whole family. That's kind of the dynamic. One of the attorneys I spoke to, that they knew that, they used that information to build this bank up for years and then just turned on the same group.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I personally was very shocked to learn that these instances of discrimination occurred so recently. In your article, you point out that the CFPB, that's the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, fined Citibank in 2023, which is, again, so recent. And you even acknowledged, again, in your article that this event was shocking for so many Americans, but it wasn't shocking to Armenians. And why is that?
I'll start off with a personal anecdote and then I'll kind of zoom out and tell you a bit more. My dad was actually taking the trash out one day. He had just gotten open heart surgery. He was just starting to move around, walked over to our trash bin, starts rolling it in, and realizes the sticker on our trash can that says Stupidian, like IAN, and it had like the red, blue, orange, the Armenian flag colors, like plastered on there. And someone had pasted it on our trash can, kind of implying that Armenians are stupid. They use the same IAN, YAN, that's very indicative of, an Armenian name. My dad at the time, he laughed it off because I mean, my dad has been called far worse, has seen far worse in his life. As I said, he was a refugee. He's been held at gunpoint. Like this man has been through a lot for a sticker to bother him. But when I say that the discrimination isn't something new, like that's a perfect example of like this still happens, not just at the corporate level, but day-to-day life. It happened now. It happened when my parents immigrated here. The Armenian history is riddled with discrimination. We have a really tumultuous history, so it's really super rich. Armenians are an ancient people. Our history spans almost 4,000 years. I think one of the first things an Armenian will tell you about is the Armenian genocide. It's like it seems like the world doesn't talk about it enough. It was the first genocide of the 21st century. The term genocide was actually coined to describe what had happened to the Armenians in 1915. And the Armenian genocide was this period of time where the Armenians living within the Ottoman Empire kind of wanted a bit more of freedom, basic rights, a bit more autonomy. The Young Turks realized this. They realized the Armenians were garnering power. They had their businesses. They were really active in political life and social life, and they wanted to kind of shut this movement down. So they orchestrated this genocide, and it began on April 24th of 1915. They rounded up intellectuals, poets, lawyers, all these big brains, if you will, and they executed them on that day. And after that, that would begin this campaign of mass extermination, mass murders. Close to, I think, 1 to 1.5 million people were murdered, exiled. My great grandparents, as I mentioned, escaped genocide. My own great grandpa has a very interesting story I won't get into now, but we have rich stories. Unfortunately, every Armenian you talk to will kind of have that story, and their families have kind of been dispersed all over the world. That's why our diaspora is so big. So that was in 1915. Unfortunately, the history, the tumultuous times didn't stop there. Most recently, I guess I'll back up a bit, but there is this region called Nagorno-Karabakh, or Armenians refer to it as Artsakh. It was a disputed territory that was granted to Azerbaijan by the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union collapsed. Ethnic Armenians had been living in the region for centuries. And after that, there was a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and they were fighting for this land. In 2020, war broke out in the region. Azerbaijan began shelling the region. So although it was de facto Armenian controlled, but it was Azerbaijani territory, they began shelling the region. And just in 2023, after about 3 years of shelling, border clashes, the entire ethnic Armenian population in Artsakh was exiled from the region. So after a 9-month period of being blockaded and starved, 120,000, the whole population, almost the entire population of Armenians from that region was completely forcibly displaced. So I say this all, it covers a bit of the history. There's so much to get into. But yeah, I think that's why it wasn't shocking, because I think the Armenians have been through far worse. Discrimination at a bank and having your accounts closed is not minor, but I mean, it's minor compared to people losing their homes and losing their lives, at the same time across the world during the same period of time. So I guess relatively, maybe Armenians weren't shocked because they knew there was far worse going on almost around the same time.
That really is such a tragic history, and you're right, that's not something we talk about enough. I don't remember even learning about the Armenian genocide in school. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit how Armenians were treated in the US once they immigrated.
Sure. So I think the major wave, or the first few Armenians who began arriving in the US in the 1900s or so, several Armenians immigrated specifically to Fresno. They were called terrible racial slurs at the time. Armenians then began to try to petition for whiteness. They wanted to be considered legally white. It was in US v. Cartosian where the judge used our religion and our ability to assimilate as primary drivers for distinguishing Armenians as different from the other inhabitants of Asia Minor. Despite this legal categorization of, quote, whiteness, I mean, Armenians are diverse. They're not all white. Most are, but not all. And so despite this ruling, I think it was still very easy for them to be pointed out not only by their appearance, but their names. And so they continued to face discrimination in their everyday lives. A lot of Armenians went on to change their names in response to this name. Jermagyan means white, so people changed their names to white. Anushian, again, the IANs, you'll notice, that means sweet, so they changed their names to sweet. And so there was this shift of people actually changing their names. It didn't stop there. Armenians were also one of the many minorities who weren't allowed to purchase property due to racially restrictive covenants. So this was as recent as 1952. A home that had just been constructed in Fresno was restricted by a covenant. It said that the property cannot be sold to the following races, and Armenians were listed against Mexicans, Japanese, Koreans, Syrians, Black people, Filipinos, and Chinese people. So there was the social aspect of it, the legal aspect of it. And as I said, I think I've heard plenty of stories, I think, from my own parents when they came to the US, the terrible things that they heard as kids. They absolutely did face discrimination when they arrived to the US.
Thank you for that context. I think it's important to recognize how discrimination and diaspora have changed and interacted throughout time. Pulling us back to Citibank, could you discuss how corporate law or corporate power more broadly has shaped the Citibank discrimination scandal?
I had some great conversations, as I've mentioned, with a couple attorneys, Ara Jabakchurian and Tamar Arminak. And Jabakchurian was kind of walking me through the legal landscape, and he explained that he was bringing two causes of action that his class action suits were looking into. One was a federal claim and one was a California state claim that was modeled after the FTC Section 5 Act. And so he was telling me how a lot of the contracts that Citibank sends out to its customers when they open accounts, lines of credit, they include arbitration clauses. An arbitration clause essentially restricts individuals from being able to resolve disputes through means other than arbitration. And arbitration is this legal process where you have like this third party usually who helps resolve a dispute, notably known as like an arbitrator, and the process doesn't involve a judge or a jury. And what's most important in this case is that Arbitration clauses usually safeguard the corporations from having to defend themselves against class action lawsuits, which are essentially lawsuits that involve a whole group of people who have been wronged in a similar manner. So what was going on with Citibank is they would send out, of course, these arbitration clauses with their contracts, but they send it with a bunch of other forms and documents, and not everyone's going to read those, and people sign away their right to essentially bring forth a class action suit. And this protects the corporation in several ways. Like several other standard arbitration clauses, Jabak Jurian explained that Citibank's clause outlined that if any issue were to arise with Citibank, the consumer would have to arbitrate the issue as opposed to seeking remedies in public court, and doesn't allow for class formation, notably. But he pointed out the California claim, and there was this, funny enough, a case called McGill v. Citibank. The California case, McGill v. Citibank, states that you can't contract away somebody's right to bring a public injunction because that's a statutory scheme to bring justice for the general public. So that was kind of the whole issue with the arbitration clauses and how Citibank had included that to basically protect against class action suits. Another piece that we can talk about is the corporate veil. And what happens essentially with the corporate veil is that when a corporation is established, a separate legal entity is formed, and the corporation becomes kind of like its own person. The corporation can take on debt, it can purchase things, enter into contracts. So the corporation is recognized as its own being, it's its own thing, and the individuals that comprise the corporation are, well, I don't know, do they even exist? So there's this protective barrier between individuals' personal assets and their business liabilities. This barrier that exists between the corporation and the people behind the corporation is what's often referred to as the corporate veil. And the corporate veil is so important in corporate law because it's what protects executives and shareholders from personal liability and legal proceedings. That's kind of the whole thing with corporate veil, criminal accountability in the corporate world in general. It's really, really tough to bring to I guess hold corporations accountable in a meaningful way because the individuals who are behind the decisions being made are able to be shielded by this veil, and the nebulous corporation is the one that will take the hit, which usually is just a financial hit, and that's pretty easy for a corporation to work around. The last piece is just the way corporations decide and assess risk in discriminatory ways. This is not unique to the Armenians at all. This is something that Black Americans have dealt with in the US, several minorities have dealt with. So as I said, definitely not unique to Armenians. It's a problem all over, unfortunately.
Thank you for explaining that. I think the idea of the corporate veil has been something that has been on my mind for a long time, but it's good to put a word to it. You also mentioned in your article the role of corporate power in the Armenian genocide itself. Could you talk a little more on that?
Of course. So I haven't had the chance to actually do some digging into the role of corporate power during the genocide. That's something that I actually wanted to look into and was curious about. Haven't gotten around to it, but I would absolutely be interested. In terms of genocide recognition, there is a lot going on there about corporate power. So the Armenian genocide, let me say, has not been recognized by Turkey, what was the former Ottoman Empire. They keep denying it. There are several books out there, several articles out there attempting to create this narrative that the genocide was just a product of war. With that said, the US also had not recognized the Armenian genocide until 2021. It was Biden who finally came out and used the term genocide. President Obama said he would use the term, but he used the Armenian word medyeren to work around it. So they got really creative there to try to avoid saying the word genocide, because that had implications. What was going on was that large corporations were lobbying against genocide recognition at this time. A lot of these big companies, they were oil companies, they had ties with Turkey, and they did not want this to come out. So they lobbied hard with their big corporate money to lobby against genocide recognition. Again, unfortunately, it didn't stop there. As I mentioned, the mass exodus that recently took place in Artsakh, the ethnic cleansing, the displacement, there's actually corporate power at play there as well. And I'm going to plug another Flaw article that actually speaks at this at length. It's written by Gayane Matevosyan. It's called How Corporate Power Facilitated Ethnic Cleansing of Indigenous Armenians in Artsakh. She wrote the piece in 2023, and she kind of gets into the ways that corporate power was helped fuel what was going on in Artsakh. And I'll say during this time, the same government that was accepting funds to deny genocide was also sending billions of dollars of aid to Azerbaijan. So the US was sending aid during this time, Israel was sending aid to Azerbaijan at this time, and there was just this big, big web of powers, several of them corporate. We can't unfortunately take the role of the corporations out of it.
Now that we have a better understanding of the history and context for the Citibank discrimination, I'm curious to learn more about the legal response. Are we seeing new legal or social movements pop up to address this issue?
I spoke with the two attorneys I've mentioned last year. So Ara was one of them, Ara Jabakchurian. He was personally leading litigation efforts for two class action suits at the time. And then Tamar Arminak was leading the Sambatyan v Citibank class action suit. When I spoke with her at this time, she was getting several calls of people wanting to join the suit. She was getting calls daily. The day I actually got to visit her office was the day I took those really extensive notes on the personal stories of what was going on. I saw 4 or 5 people come in and tell their stories, and she said, I get people like this coming in every day. So I actually sat there, I listened in on these stories, and there were talks of an LA City case being brought forth as well. So I think just a couple of days ago, there were a bunch of articles released about a recent development of an LA City case. So the LA Civil Rights Department is now actively investigating claims that several big banks are continuing to show bias against Armenians. So even though Citibank has agreed to pay their fine, it looks like LA City is saying that the problem actually goes beyond just Citibank. This is a problem across several national banks that operate in the Los Angeles area. In some ways, it's hopeful. It's sad that this isn't a uniquely Citibank problem, but it's great that the LA Civil Rights Department is taking this on, and it's not just Mary and Ada who are leading these class action suits. I'm sure several other attorneys are also taking it on. There were just so many people that were denied lines of credit, whose accounts were closed, and who need the assistance. So I'm very glad to see that there is some sort of action being taken.
Yeah, I'm glad we're finally seeing some action in this area. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what does the ideal remedy for this type of discrimination look like? And what other types of solutions, either legal, political, or social, should we adopt to prevent similar types of discrimination?
I wish I had the answers, all of those answers. I will say that monetary remedies are not enough. So money damages usually are given to those who are affected, and that can be punitive or compensatory. Punitive meaning they get money based on as a way to like punish Citibank, or it could be compensatory based on the exact loss that they faced. I think money damages are important. I think individuals should be compensated. But as I said, I don't think that's the only way that this should be done. I think Citibank needs to take some sort of action. There's this term called in the legal world called injunctive relief, which is basically a court order that tells someone they can no longer do something or that they have to do something. So in this case, I think it would be great to order Citibank to not use the same discriminatory practices they've been using over and over again. Possibly a way to do that is to require them to include in writing the reasons for closing a certain account. and being descriptive of why that's happening. Araca Bakçuryan had an interesting idea about holding executives criminally accountable for these types of wrongs. I think that's a very interesting idea. And then Tamar had this idea about boycotting Citibank, for example, and just using boycotting as this measure for encouraging others to stop taking their business to places where they're not welcomed. I think some combination of monetary remedies, some sort of injunctive relief, maybe a combination of all three of the things I've just discussed, including the boycotting, could be effective and could have some sort of an impact. And I hope would help to prevent similar types of discrimination. I think another piece of that is just talking about it and doing this and making sure people know that this is happening. A lot of times it's just about uncovering what's going on and keep these corporations accountable and let them know that we are watching, that things aren't going to just, they're not going to be able to coast by with such discriminatory practices.
Totally agreed. This has all been so eye-opening. And just to wrap things up, your article and our conversation here today have inspired me, and I'm sure many others, to learn more about this topic. Where can we go to learn more?
I would say there are plenty of great resources. Depends on what you want to read about. Like a simple Google search about Citibank Armenian discrimination. You'll see a bunch of articles pop up about the Armenian genocide. But I am going to use this opportunity to actually plug my dad's film. My dad is a filmmaker, so I mentioned him in the beginning of this story. And he had this independent feature film called After Freedom. This was, I believe, produced in the 2000s. I'm actually featured in it as a 2-year-old. So you can see me on there. But my dad's film actually follows the story of a young Armenian man who immigrates to the US, to Glendale specifically. Happens to be a common thread there. So I'm going to plug that film. As I said, it's called After Freedom.
Looks like I have a new movie to watch. That's all we have time for today. Talish, thank you so much for joining us on Flaw School.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
I also want to say thank you for a wonderful conversation. I've learned so much about the law, about the Armenian genocide, about topics I think have not been talked about enough.
Thanks, T, and thanks for this opportunity.
And also, I just want to take a brief moment to thank you, T, for being such a great co-host.
Likewise. And if you're interested in reading Talish's full article or learning more about the flaws in our legal system, check out the Flaw magazine at theflaw.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, first make sure to check out the show notes. There will be some awesome links and references there. And make sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also check out flawschool.org for more content. Thank you all for listening. Looking forward to talking at you in the future. Class is dismissed.